Good afternoon, and I'm Josh Kraushaar, the senior political correspondent at Axios, and I'm very pleased to be here moderating this FMC panel with two of the most distinguished former members of Congress, also the most politically attuned, politically savvy former lawmakers as heads of the political campaign committees in their time in Congress. Quick introductions, and then I want to just get right into breaking down what happened this past week in the midterm elections. On the panel is former Congressman Tom Davis, the representative of Virginia's 11th Congressional District from 1995 to 2008. Tom served as the chairman of the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform from 2003 to 2007. And in addition to Tom's committee chairmanship, he served as the chairman of the NRCC for 2 terms during the 2000 and 2002 cycles, which happened to be among the more politically fruitful and successful elections, especially that 2002 election in recent history. Also on the panel today is the Honorable Martin Frost, who, as you know, served as a Democratic congressman from Texas's 24th Congressional District from 1979 to 2005. During Congressman Frost's time in office, he served as chair of the DCCC in the 1996 and 1998 election cycles, and also as chair of the House Democratic Caucus from 1999 to 2003. So without further ado, I want to turn it over to both Tom and Martin to give their opening remarks and an overview of the takeaways from the midterm elections.
Tom, you're up.
Well, thanks, Josh, thanks. Let me start by saying I think Republicans had every expectation this would be a better year for them. The Senate was always going to be a little tougher because of the representatives that were up. The Republicans had 2 straight successful cycles in the previous 6-year cycles. So there weren't as many targets for them as you might have had in the past. So the Senate was always going to be a little tougher, but the House, given the fact that 36 of the last 39 elections, the President's party had lost seats. The last 4 times the President's party had controlled the House, the Senate, and the presidency, their losses had been huge losses, and the House had flipped. The fact that historically the out party has more intensity, they're angrier. All of these, and the independents generally in midterm swing toward the out party, gave Republicans high expectations. Of course, at the end of the day, that's not exactly what happened. The Republicans did, it appears, pick up the House, but most of that is just structural in the fact that during redistricting, they picked up a lot of these seats in the redistricting cycle. So the Democrats didn't really start off 4 or 5 seats down. They started off about even at best. And we'll get into that with our slides a little later. The Dobbs decision, I think, changed the whole intensity model for the out party. We see that abortion moved from an issue that helped Republicans to, once the win had come for the pro-life groups, the intensity moved to the outside, and that really helped Democratic turnout, as we could see in those 5 special elections leading up to November and on election day itself. So I'll stop there. We have a number of slides to go through, but I'll just say that by introductory comments and then turn it over to Martin.
Well, thank you, Tom. And of course, we will also not only just review the results, but the implication of the results, the implications on House and Senate leadership positions and on the legislative agenda during the lame duck and the next session of Congress. This is a very interesting topic, and we have a lot to cover. When I was chair of the DCCC, this was one of the 3 times in the last 100 years that the president's party did not lose seats. Now, we this time lost a very small number. Normally, the president's party loses a lot of seats. In fact, in 1998, we gained 5 seats, and Tom was chair in 2002. There were only 3 instances in the last 100 years. One of the others was when Tom was chair in 2002, and the Republicans had the presidency, and they picked up seats. So this was a very unusual election. I would characterize this as a status quo election when all's said and done. Not a single senator who was up for re-election lost his seat. And in fact, so far, only 1 Senate seat has changed parties. That was Pennsylvania. Also, the House, as Tom mentioned, Democrats lost the House largely because of the Republicans' successful effort on redistricting. Other than that, it was pretty much of a wash. And you'll see throughout the discussion, for whatever reason, the public decided, well, you know, we're not going to make any big changes here. They small change. They're going to get the Republicans get the House, Democrats get the Senate, and Republican and Democrats got a few governorships. So Tom and I have followed this all of our adult lives. Tom was a very able chairman of the Republican campaign committee, and I think I did a pretty good job the 2 times I was chairman of the Democratic committee. We picked up a total of 14 seats in those 2 elections. So Tom's got some slides he's going to present. I will make some comments on the slides, and then our moderator will ask some tough questions, and we'll do the best we can to answer those questions. Tom, it's all yours. And Grayson, you
let me start by thanking Bruce Melman of Melman and Castellanes, who put together a number of these slides, has given our permission to use them. These slides, as he says, are out in the public domain. They square for the most part with our analysis, and we'll put these up for you, go through what happened, and at the end we'll have plenty of time for really questions and comments where I'm sure many of you will be able to add some things we didn't even think about. It was the least change election since 2002. What we basically saw is this was just a reaffirmation of the polarization we see in politics today. Red states getting redder, blue states getting bluer at this point. But it was an incumbent election for the most part. Very few incumbents lost along the way. Voters sought stability at a time of heightened disruption, with a lot of talk going on around disruption. Voters opted for the devil they knew versus what they didn't know. Candidates really mattered. Republicans saw this in a number of races that we can get into specifics on the Q&A, where they nominated what I like to call exotic candidates that didn't fit the mold, that didn't have experience, that had taken some positions that were outside the mainstream, and that cost them. Oftentimes in an election, in a midterm election, it doesn't matter. It becomes a parliamentary wave election. That didn't materialize this time, and I think a lot of that was because of the nature of some of these Republican candidates. And of course, the Democrats with their January 6th committee and the like. Donald Trump continued to exert himself up, called attention to the fact that you couldn't just turn the page on the previous administration, making this election somewhat of a rerun of 2016 and 2020, as opposed to a referendum on Joe Biden. The confrontation, competition, and uneasy cooperation will define the next 2 years. The real question for Republicans are, you got a narrow margin in the House, what are you going to do with it legislatively? There are always opportunities. We saw this in the 104th Congress, 105th Congress, 106th, where you had a divided government, and we ended up balancing the budget, stability with the Mexican peso falling down, welfare reform. And then we've seen times where everything comes to a halt, and the administration just comes back and governs by executive order and regulation.
Tom, if I could add one point. You don't need to look any farther than what happened after the 1996, or the time leading up to the 1998 election, after 96. Basically, Gingrich was Republican Speaker, Clinton was president, and the Republican Speaker and the Democratic president made some deals which preserved the status quo for both parties. Clinton got reelected and the Republicans held on to the House. The deals were, they agreed to an increase in the minimum wage, which the Democrats wanted, and they agreed to welfare reform, which the Republicans wanted. Now, I'm not sure that's possible given the current environment, but there is a path forward. And 96, the month before the election in 96 and the time after it, is a pretty good indicator in history that a Democratic leader and a Republican leader can make some deals which benefit both parties. Tom?
Yeah, that was before Fox and MSNBC and the internet, but that's true. We called it triangulation those days, where the Republican Congress threw Bob Dole under the bus that helped Clinton, but also helped reelect them. Next slide. So we don't know how, it looks like Republicans may pick up 7 to 9 seats. We'll have to wait till it's seen, but basically this is a status quo election. Next slide. Notice where the battlegrounds were. The blue states got bluer, the red states got red. We didn't see anybody really jumping on any lines. We did see Bebo out in Colorado almost upset. But that's a squishy district in some ways because you've got Pueblo and Aspen and Vail and some of these counties that are undergoing change out there. And her race was closer, even though it was a solid Trump district. But for the most part, everything was played between the 40-yard lines. And if you were outside of that, for the most part, you were safe. Certainly in these Senate races and bunching them together, it showed that the Trump states stayed red, Biden states went blue, no matter what the quality of the candidate. Next slide. Senate control in a president's first midterm, we lose sight of this, but they generally hold the Senate. Part of that is just the election cycles that you get into, but it tends, the electorate tends to take it out more on House members than the Senate. Next slide. This just shows the, I don't know if you can see the end of it, but House races lost by the party holding the White House in the midterms. Martin, our two terms in 98 and 2002 kind of stand out, but this is just, this is history.
We were the exception that proved the rule.
Yeah, I'd love to take credit for it, but it was a lot of things going on in 2002, including redistricting and 9/11. Next slide. This is an interesting slide. It just shows that the eligible turnout was this is a high turnout election. Wasn't as high as 2018, but it was a high turnout election. There was no voter suppression. Voters showed up. Both sides kind of got their bases out at this point. In fact, it appears Democrats won independents, which is really an anomaly for a midterm election like this.
And Tom, if I would add also, the conventional wisdom for many years, not in the last couple of years, but for many years, was that a high turnout helped the Democrats. Then it's flipped and people thought, well, maybe a high turnout is going to help the Republicans. Well, the point is that this election, a high turnout marginally did help the Democrats. So the conventional wisdom has been thrown out the window. We don't know exactly who's going to benefit from a high turnout, but you're correct. Democrats carried independents by about 2 or 3 votes, and maybe that made the difference.
Well, in part of that conventional wisdom goes back to the days when the Democrats were more a blue-collar party, where the Republicans were the party of the country club. But what we've seen over the last 25 years is the Republican base is matriculated from the country club to country. They've become a more rural, non-college party, and non-college voters less likely to vote than educated voters. So that's kind of turned on its axis. And secondly, minority groups, particularly African Americans, have really learned how to turn out their vote, no matter kind of what the rules are. So I think that's kind of evened that up at this point. The point is, everybody showed up. Nobody can say that they got cheated at this point. It's a very evenly divided country. Next slide. They look for stable political. We can skip over this, but again, this shows during difficult times, stability tends to rule the day. And if you're a little outside the mainstream, voters didn't appear to be looking for this in the general election, maybe in the primaries, but not in the general election. Next slide. This is interesting, showing what's happened in Florida. 2 of my partners here at Holland Night were former Florida members. They knew DeSantis was going to win. It would be double digits. Nobody quite had any idea how big that win would be. Part of that is if you look at voter registration from 18 to 22, it moved from a 300,000 vote Democratic advantage to a 300,000 vote Republican advantage. Migrations from the north at this point seem to favor Republicans, but look at how much better DeSantis did than Trump. Trump has a much lower ceiling. DeSantis, a much wider appeal. You know, part of that is just in who they are. DeSantis, magna cum laude from Yale, Harvard Law School, speaks a language to middle-class voters. Trump, being much more blunt, didn't seem to do that. But across the board, DeSantis performed better than Trump.
Let's be clear. Tom and I are not predicting about who the Republican nominee is going to be. Tom may have some feelings about that, but I don't think either one of us can predict at this point that Trump won't be the Republican or that DeSantis will be the Republican. It's very early.
And I'd say to Josh, Josh, maybe we got to go out of the prediction business and be in the day after business after the midterm.
Okay, go ahead.
Next slide. The candidates that started to question the election results and the like, basically got pretty crushed. They might have won the primary. This shows, though, where Democrats invested in Republican candidates that they thought were not as electable. There was a lot of criticism at the time of using Democratic money to help Republicans, because had this been a wave, some of these Republicans might have come into office with the help of Democratic money. In point of fact, that didn't happen this time. That money was well spent by Democrats. It reminds me of, Martin, what we did in 2000 to Mike Forbes when he switched parties. We came up and beat him with Regina Seltzer in the Democratic primary, putting Republican money in a Democratic primary.
Yeah, the best example of this in recent years was Claire McCaskill in her next to last race. She's the one who kind of started this in a big way, of pointing out how extreme the Republican candidate in the primary was. Of course, she wanted to run against the most extreme one, and she spent money which kind of solidified that candidate's support among the right-wing base. And that's exactly what Democrats did in some of these states.
And not to tell war stories, but with Mike Forbes, we ran him as a Republican in the Democratic primary, reminded everybody of his pro-life and pro-gun record.
So both parties are up to shenanigans from time to time. You can criticize. The Democrats got criticized for doing this time, but it turned out to be the right decision.
Well, we didn't call it shenanigans, Warren. We just called it voter information, but I hear you. Next slide.
Yeah, go ahead.
Next slide. So these were the arguments, as you say, trying to scare the other party. You know, generally you run negative races. Republicans, the Democrats said, were criminalizing abortion. They were undermining democracy. They were disruptors. You see the party approval down, Trump's approval down. People don't like Republicans and they didn't like Trump. Democrats were saddled us with this economy, wide open border, crime going up, woke moralizers. You see, neither party is really very well liked, and neither of their leaders are very well liked. And so the race was fought within that at this point. Ordinarily, in a general election like this, in an off year, this would have been a referendum on the Democrats. But because Trump played such a role in this and the like, it turned out that it became much more of a choice election to a lot of Americans. Trump's foibles were ways to get the Democratic vote out. And by the way, we had seen this the year before in Virginia. Although the Republicans won, although the Republicans had won the election, it was a huge turnout, and the Democrats got their base vote out. Next slide.
Let me point out, because this slide may be a little hard for some people to read. The column on the left that says Democrats at the top of it, that's what the Republicans were saying about the Democrats. And the column on the right is what the Democrats were saying about the Republicans. So you have to have little arrows that kind of cross here.
Those are the narratives. Next slide.
Yeah, now I'm going to tell one war story, if I may. In 1994, which was the year the Republicans took the House for the first time in 40 years, I sensed early that there was real trouble in my own district. And so I had my consultant do a poll in late June, early July, and it came back that I was only 6 points ahead of a totally unknown Republican challenger. And at that point, I then made the decision that I was going to lay down some pretty good negatives on my opponent early. And I picked the crime issue because actually my opponent had taken some positions that were weak on crime, and he never recovered from that, quite frankly. So if you're going to do this, you got to do it early.
Yeah, you want to exactly. Who said kill it in the cradle? Don't let your opponent get legs. Yeah. So let's talk about abortion. When I saw the exit polls on election night, I said, you know, this is not going to be a big night for Republicans as I had anticipated, because abortion really right up there with inflation is a key issue of the people as they were leaving the polls. And if you look at the right, look at the bottom right-hand corner, the abortion issue in terms of its emphasis for voters and its intensity, it really switched from being a Republican message that worked to a Democratic message that worked. Why is that? Well, winners generally, winners win. They kind of forget about it and move on. The losers in this case, the Democrats and pro-choice groups, just got inflamed. And so the issue really, really worked for Democrats this time. The Republican base, not so much. They kind of won the war. You win a policy battle, whether it's healthcare or whatever, the people that lose generally get more inflamed and they're more intense. And that was clearly true on abortion. And but for the Dobbs decision, I think this might have been a very different election.
And
crime and gun policy kind of cancel each other out because they tend to be played differently to the basis. But the abortion issue did play a role in this. Martin, let me just add, we saw this in the special elections in Minnesota and Nebraska and New York prior to Election Day. You could see this. The theory Republicans had is, well, independents aren't running. These are low turnout affairs. When independents show up, they're going to break our way. And that was the Republican theory of the case right up until today. But it didn't quite work out that way.
Well, and a lot of the early analysis, and we'll see more detailed analysis after all the votes have been counted, and we know exactly what the vote was in each state. But what happened was that the abortion issue motivated younger voters in a way that probably no other issue has motivated younger voters to vote Democratic in recent years. So you had the early results show that you had a pretty good turnout among younger voters and voters in the next age group up. And then as you get to about age 40 to 45, then the abortion issue was not helpful to Democrats. But it clearly was among younger voters, and the mobilization of younger voters in this election because of abortion, may have made the difference in some of these Senate races.
Yeah, I mean, the intensity issue, which Republicans ordinarily would enjoy, is the out party. This was basically equalized that to some extent. Next slide. Next slide. There we go. What's going to happen in the lame duck? Let's go back for just a second. We'll leave you up. What's going to happen in the lame duck? Let's just, the appropriations, my guess is they're going to move that out as quick as they can at this point, not leave that hanging around because it only gets uglier as you go to the next Congress. NDAA, you seem to always get that. You've got some extenders, judges and nominations. And then these other issues are a solid chance. And with that is the Respect for Marriage Act, which Schumer claims he's got the 60 votes to do that, electoral count reform. But this is what we see in terms of what's happening. The key, I think, is the debt ceiling extension. What's going to happen on that? Do they get that done now, or do they leave that to McCarthy to try to carve a majority with his caucus with Democratic help to get that across the finish line? And of course, that's a big question for people who consistently voted against it. In the last Congress, having him vote for it is always a tough sell.
I think the prediction for the lame duck is that very little will get done. They'll do absolutely what they have to do and get out of town.
Well, here's a list, and I think the list is something they'll be looking at. Next slide. Factions, as you know, Republican faction now is so, I mean, you can have 4 or 5 members try to hold up everything. This will be for whoever the Republican nominee is, the Republican Party, can they hold together? Of course, in 2000, we had a 5-seat majority. In 2006, we were at 6 seats back and forth, and Republicans held their conference together. Pelosi held a very narrow margin. Republicans more fractious right now, not as clear they're going to make it as smooth. And this will be a real test of McCarthy and the Republican conference to see if they can come together and produce a work product and even produce a speaker. I'd add on the speaker's vote, McCarthy, they're voting as we speak. McCarthy will certainly win the conference vote. Question is, can you get to a majority on the House floor? He doesn't need 218, he just needs a majority of those voting. One of the tricks of the trade is, of course, to have members abstain where they can keep their pledge not to vote for McCarthy, and you just need more votes than the Democrat. I'm reminded that Boehner was elected speaker because Mario Cuomo's funeral in New York was the same day, and a number of Democrats were missing that kept his bogey, the number he needed to get, lower. But that remains to be seen, and that will be a discussion among Republicans between now and January 3rd.
Yeah, and the vote is the first day of the session of Congress in early January, unless something happens to postpone that date. But
Martin, we're talking to former members; they all know it.
Yeah, well, but there are other people watching this that may not know that. There are people who are from embassies. There are people who have supported the former Members Association over the years and friends. So not everybody knows that vote is the first day of the new session in January. So this thing is not over. And what happened in 2018 Nancy Pelosi had to make, let's just say, a few arrangements. You can call them deals, but she had to make a few arrangements with some dissidents in her own party to make sure that she would be able to get the 218 that she needed.
Right. And just so you know, historically, some of these votes have gone more than one vote. I think they went over 100 votes one year and didn't get a speaker until March, but really nothing.
Yeah, not recently, though. Not recently.
No. But I'm just saying historically, there is precedent for this. And they may go for more than one vote in this particular before they can sort it out in the Republican conference. The other side of it is what you've seen in some states is where the Democrats or Republicans will go to the majority party and cut a deal with a faction, make one of them speaker in return for some community.
That's not going to happen here.
But it's happened in other states. It's happened in Alaska, it's happened in California, and a number of other states, New York, where they will cut deals. And so you just have to see where it all plays out. Next slide. Oversight, you can see the difference of where the Democrats do oversight and the Republicans at this point. We've got this, I'd add, the crypto is going to be, I think now with crypto is going to be front and center for Republicans as they look at the collapse of this crypto company that gave over $4 million, I think, to the Democrats, or I think it's 40 million. They're going to have a field day now. So controlling the House, there's not a small, medium, or large. You control the House, you control the gavels. And as you look on the right, I think all of these are going to be investigated. They may not get much legislation inside, but they'll get, there'll be plenty of oversight and subpoenas will be flying off the wall.
Now, Tom, I would point out there's a little note in yellow at the bottom of the left column. It says, note, 51 seats would give Senate Dems subpoena power, 50 does not. So the Georgia race makes a big difference. If the Democrats win the Georgia race, they have 50 votes, 51 votes, and they'll have subpoena power in the Senate. If they don't win it, they won't have subpoena power in the Senate. Republicans have subpoena power in the House.
Needless to say, there'll be little coordination between the House and Senate on the investigations. Next slide. Fiscal fights. Complicated. Yeah, but the bottom line is when we've gone into spending sprees before, we've had to go into austerity hangings. We remember going through sequestration and all of these issues that walk through. We've been on a huge spending spree lately, and sooner or later, you can't keep running up these kind of deficits before Congress starts.
But let's be clear that spending spree has been with Republican presidents as well as Democratic presidents. That's not just a Democratic activity. You had the deficit was run up quite a bit when Trump was president.
Yeah, my comments were, of course, put in a nonpartisan basis. That's true. And we'll see on a bipartisan basis probably tightening up on this stuff as well.
Yeah.
Next slide. Yeah. We don't know what Biden's shuffle will be, but the cabinet member turnover by presidents usually get a pretty good turnover in the third year. We'll see what happens with the Biden administration. We'll see if he runs again. And we can hold that up for the discussion. And I think we want to get to questions. So next slide. Yeah,
I think we need to get
the governance model. I just say the governance model is you govern by executive order, regulation. Because you can't get things legislatively. Our advice to people is there's going to be a lot of young members in Congress. Get to know them. I talked to my successor, Jerry Conley. He's 100. He's got a nice big office in Rayburn now, overlooking the Capitol. I never had that, and he says, "Yeah, I'm number 100." So I never got there with my 7 terms, but just a lot of new blood rotating in and out of Congress. Next slide.
Oh, you got a lot of words here on the slide. Maybe you can summarize, Tom.
Well, polling, although polling gets criticized, it mostly got it right. The averages of errors were small. It's hard to look at a state where they were way off. Georgia's voting laws did not disenfranchise. You look at the voter turnouts, we saw this in the primaries. As Republicans, Martin, we always believe that these are not voter suppression laws in the traditional sense, that it's not made to people so the people who want to vote can always vote. They have 30-day election day now.
We won't get into a long argument.
Yeah, I've just got to editorialize. We believe it's about people who don't want to vote, getting them out to vote. But at any rate, the numbers here show people showed up. Yeah. Secondly, Michigan, epitomize the Republican failures. A bad top of the ticket would take the ticket down in Michigan. It cost them the House and Senate as well in the state of Michigan, which put right to work, on the chopping table. New York gerrymander, Democratic overreach there might have cost them the House. It's a 4-seat swing. DeSantis gerrymandered an additional seat or two that the legislature didn't want to do. But between those two states, that's going to be the difference in the House. Yeah. Democrats outspent the Republicans at all levels. 1914, the last time no incumbent senator lost. We don't know what's going to happen here for sure because you have a Georgia runoff, but this is basically unprecedented. 1934, the last election where the opposition party lost net Senate and governor's races, but that was a realignment year.
It was right after the Depression started.
Yeah, and in the transformation of Florida, which I don't think is just a one-off, it goes from Hillary Clinton winning Dade County by 29 points to DeSantis carrying it by more than 10 points. And then this is not stock option. I'm just always looking at this. Traditionally, S&P has increased in the year following a midterm election since 19.
And I always told groups when I spoke to business groups and to regular citizens after an election, don't take anything that I say as investment advice.
I'm going to wait for the Fed to quit raising interest rates. But anyway, that's not advice. I'm not very good at that. So we'll go on to questions.
Well, thank you, Congressman Davis and Congressman Frost, for your insights. I've got a lot of questions. I know you may also have questions that you can ask in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So I'll try to ask some of my most pertinent questions and also get audience feedback as well. Let me start with the election results. One of the things that surprised me the most, and you went over quite extensively, was that this midterm didn't follow the trajectory of a lot of past midterms. You mentioned Trump, you mentioned abortion as two big factors. I wanted to ask you, which one do you think was the bigger factor? Was it the Trump effect? Was it the Trump candidates? Was it abortion mobilizing Democratic turnout? How would you weigh those two issues in so far as the vote went and the Democratic overperformance?
I'll start. Both were important. However, I think the weakness of some of the Republican Senate candidates ultimately was the deciding factor in the Senate races.
Yeah, I think Trump's candidate selection in a number of House races is too. New Hampshire, Michigan, Washington State, where he goes after members who'd vote for impeachment that I think would have survived. So I think his candidate selection wasn't that good, but I think the key was abortion. You take a look at those exit polls, 27% were motivated by abortion to come out, and those broke 4-1 Democratic. I think that was the key at this point. So it's almost, Josh, like you had two incumbent parties. The Supreme Court incumbent party being the Republicans and the Congressional being the Democrats. And I think that changed the turnout model in favor, that gave the Democrats basically, it evened it up for them. That's my thought. Trump was a factor, and I think for the most part, not a favorable factor for Republicans in the midterm. And they need to look at that as they look ahead to the next election. But it was abortion.
One other election result question. Dave Wasserman at the Cook Report keeps a tally of the House vote, the national House vote, and there's still votes coming in, of course, but one thing that I was surprised by is that Republicans, as of now, have about a 4.5-point advantage on the national House vote, which, given historical trends, usually would add up to a bigger Republican gain in the House and a bigger night for Republicans. What do you make of this disconnect, if it holds, between the House popular vote going, quite significantly for Republicans and not netting the seats that they expected?
Well, Josh, if all things being equal, if that's the case, that's a huge change, because it used to be Democrats had such an advantage because they overperformed in so many districts and wasted votes. This would be the opposite. But I think we need to look beneath that. I think you'll see a number of districts where Democrats didn't run a candidate. So they get no credit. Or in California, where you have two Democrats running and they only get credit for one. And so I think we need to look at that a little more carefully. But if that shows, it shows that this latest track of redrawing the districts has evened the score for Democrats, to the point that they no longer have to overperform to hold the House. And that's a significant difference.
I would agree with that.
All right, we've got some questions that I want to get to. I think perhaps the most notable is January 6th. We didn't see a whole lot of Democratic candidates campaign on January 6th. But I wonder, given the results, like what impact do you think the January 6th committee had in defining the Republican Party brand negatively? And what impact did the committee hearings itself have on the election?
Let me start with that. I think they did a masterful job in presenting what happened, and good use of video. Often these hearings are very dull. They had some outside help in terms of making this interesting. And I think the hearings did help the Democrats.
So Luria lost, and she was on the committee. It certainly didn't save her. And Virginia, that district was marginally more Republican than the district she had run in the time before. And Republicans had an outstanding candidate there in Jen Pickens. But I think more than anything else, what it did for, quote, the election deniers, so to speak, is it tainted them. Those that weren't, I'm not sure it had the same kind of effect, but where they headed the ticket, like in Pennsylvania or Michigan, I think it depressed Republican votes and was certainly a net plus for the Democrats at the end of the day.
Tom, you were talking about oversight and the likelihood of having oversight in overdrive in the next 2 years. But if the Republican House majority is as thin as it looks, how likely do you think the party will stay together when it comes to potential investigations of Hunter Biden or Fauci coming to the committees to ask questions about oversight and how he handles COVID? Do you expect a unified Republican caucus given the diversity within for some of these investigations?
Remember, Tom chaired the committee that does oversight when he was in Congress, so he can speak to this better than almost anyone.
So I don't think it's going to make any difference. A win is a win. And the committee chairman now, if you look at the rules of the last Congress, every committee chairman had subpoena power on their own. You didn't have to go. Now, if you really want to look downstream, and I've had some clients before the committee, we can always go and say, okay, you want to subpoena my client to show up? Do you have the votes on the House floor? Because they're not going to show. And that's where it may make a difference. But for the most part, if you get a subpoena, people are going to pay attention to it. If it's an administration figure, they can, of course, may not go after it. But look, a win is a win. A subpoena power chairmanship doesn't need the permission of everybody to go. I don't think it's going to slow the Republicans down a bit.
And what about there's been talk about impeaching DHS Secretary Mayorkas, even President Biden himself. Does that change given the narrow majority?
Yeah, you got to have a majority on the floor. Nobody wants to go through this and lose a floor vote. So
of course, it takes 2/3 to remove anybody in the Senate, and you'll never have that.
Yeah.
Well, nobody cares. I mean, they don't care. Impeachment's become more like a no confidence vote if you take a look at how it's been employed over the last 20 years. And so 25 years going back to the Clinton side. And I think people are tired of that at this point. So, but I think it makes it harder for Republicans, particularly some of these Republicans in California and swing districts, to vote for impeachment that's not popular. Now, that's not to say some event couldn't occur that would lead to that. But I think given the facts as we know them at this point and the fact that it hasn't stopped some members from introducing impeachment resolutions, I just don't, it's not likely under these circumstances. But we don't know what could develop.
I think the Republicans make a mistake if they put too many eggs in the impeachment basket. When I was chair in 1998, ultimately, we picked up seats because the public came to a decision that what Bill Clinton did was not an impeachable offense. And that was one of and Gingrich decided to make that the closing argument in 98. He made a mistake.
Yeah, I agree.
We've got a question from Brendan Curry on the chat room about the Russia-Ukraine war and support for Ukraine in Congress. It didn't seem like a huge issue on the campaign trail, but what type of resonance do you think that has with the electorate, and what did you make of the results insofar as American support for?
Let me start on this. I think the Republicans make a horrible mistake if they try and drastically reduce aid to Ukraine. This is the American public doesn't like the Russians. We don't like the old Soviets or the current Russians, and they're not going to win any popularity contests in the United States. And I think we need, on a bipartisan basis, to continue significant support for Ukraine.
I think that the support will continue with what the president wants. I think part of this was a ruse on the part of the Republicans to just say, you better get these appropriation bills done early because we may take it apart, and just kind of incentivize the Democrats to move through appropriations. I don't see any problem.
I want to ask you guys to look in your crystal balls ahead to 2024, since it sounds like tonight we may get an announcement from one 2024 presidential candidate in Donald Trump. What do you make of the possibility of a DeSantis-Trump primary matchup with other Republicans certainly likely to run as well? And what do you think the odds he'll be the nominee in 24 again?
Let Tom start with that. It's his party.
So, yeah, look, Trump didn't start off in 2016 the favorite either. He worked his way through it, but it's a different dynamic. Now he's been president for 4 years. He's got a lot of flies on him now. A lot of, there's a lot of baggage he didn't have before. If he picks a fight with DeSantis, he could end up taking them both down. But I think it's going to be considerably more difficult for him. Number one, he'll be 78 years old. Number two, you got to go through the snows of New Hampshire and win voters one by one. He didn't carry Iowa last time. And I think there'll be a number of pretenders to the throne on the Republican side, DeSantis being the leader right up. I mean, DeSantis is out of central casting in a sense. He's from a huge state. He's 44 years old. He's got all the credentials that you could want. Republicans, and I think Democrats too, need a generational change. I think the party that makes the generational change in their nominee is likely to win. So if it's Trump versus the younger Democrat, I think it's going to be very difficult. And I think if Biden runs and Republicans can find a younger candidate, it's hard to. I don't know how you can measure that, but I think one of the reasons Clinton won in '92 is he was a baby boomer. People were ready for that generational change. So I think Trump is certainly at this point the favorite as he starts out, but I think he's got a long haul to get renominated given the baggage that he's gotten, given the results that he kind of owns from this, given what else can happen in the courts and discovery on this thing. I think Republicans are at the end of the day going to give him a gold watch and say, thank you for the Supreme Court and what you did, and we'll put your picture on the wall and let's move on. But we'll see.
You didn't ask me about Biden, but I'll answer the question.
Yeah, that was my next question. But yeah, let me frame it this way: would Democrats be better renominating Biden at age 82, or would they be better off starting from scratch for a new generation of leadership?
This is a very personal decision to be made by Biden. Let me point out, I'm the same age as Joe Biden. We were both born in 1942. And I need a nap in the afternoon. It's not the same as when you're 45 or 50 years old running for president when you're 80 or 81. Now, I think Biden's been a very good president. I supported him. I think he's been successful. The decision is his as to whether he runs again, and his family's. And I don't know what that decision will be, quite frankly. But I think it's very hard to run for president, even as an incumbent, when you're as old as he is.
Martin, let me just add, I think it's very hard to beat an incumbent president that wants to get nominated. They have so many levers of control. And Jimmy Carter, Ted Kennedy found that out the hard way, right, with Carter. We'll see. It's a long way to go. And I'm not in the predicting game as we start out, but I do think the country's ready for a generational change.
And again, no one should ignore the fact that Biden has been a successful president on a very difficult time. And he deserves a lot of credit for that. And the decision is his and his family's as to whether he runs again.
Martin, is there anyone that you think is particularly strong if Biden decides not to run for president again?
It's hard to tell. It'll be a big field. And I don't know what the answer to that is. But going to Tom's point is that there have been the parties almost never deny a sitting president their nomination. Kennedy tried to take it away from Carter. They didn't do it. Reagan tried to take it away from Ford. They didn't do it. And there have been a few one-term presidents in recent years. Ford was a half-term president. George H.W. Bush was a one-term president. So it does happen. But the public generally gives the president a second term if they think he's done a good job. So there are a lot of factors going on here, and I have no idea if Joe Biden decides not to run, and I have no idea whether that's going to happen or not. I don't know who the Democratic nominee will be, and it'll be a very interesting field if that happens.
We have a question from Congressman Chris Shays about moderate
Connecticut, Republican from Connecticut.
The question is a really good one. There's some newly elected moderate Republicans. There are moderate Republicans that have served for some time. What are the odds that, given the narrow majority, that there could be some, bipartisan coalitions using the folks in tough districts, majority makers on the Republican side, working with Democrats to get bipartisan legislation accomplished.
Well, what you got to remember is who controls the floor, and that is McCarthy or whoever the Republican speaker controls the floor. So you may have the members that can move legislation through, but if you don't control the floor, now Chris knows from Shays Meehan that you can circumvent that, with a petition, with a discharge petition. But by and large, when you elect your leaders, you're giving the floor over to them. I do hold out this. It's a distant deal, but if the Republicans start tripping over themselves on the speakership, that the Democrats could turn to another Republican, and better a speaker for 2 years than never at all, and cut some kind of deal where you could have another Republican speaker with Democratic support, somebody trying to govern both, and deal out the committee chairmanships on a more equal basis. So we just have to wait and see where that goes. It's a good question.
And, I've been asked by media, what advice would I give to a newly elected member of either party? And my advice was look for opportunities to work across the aisle, look for opportunities to be bipartisan. Now, whether new members can do that is another matter, because Tom and I have written about this in the book we did on Congress and in some articles we've written, that the current system does not favor or makes incumbents nervous. The current system makes incumbents nervous for a challenge in their own party. Republicans are looking over their right shoulder. They're worried someone more conservative will run in the primary. Democrats are looking over their left shoulder, worried someone more liberal will run in the primary. The current system does not reward bipartisanship, and that's too bad. And I hope somehow we can overcome that.
We've got a question about early voting. We now have many states allowing almost up to a month or more in some states of early voting. It's a change from when you guys were campaign committee chairman. Do you think the parties are effectively adjusting their timelines, their messaging to address the changes in voting law across the country?
The answer to that is yes. And my state, which is not known for being a liberal progressive state, was one of the first states in the country to institute early voting, in-person early voting. Texas, my state of Texas. I think Texas and Tennessee may have been the first two states to institute significant early voting. I think it's been very successful. People have had to change their campaigns, the way they spend their money, what their emphasis is. And while there have been some reductions, Republican legislatures have tried to reduce the time for early voting in some states. I think it's here to stay, and I think it's an important part of our system.
I think a 30-day election day is ridiculous.
I'm not talking about a 30-day. In Texas, we started off with a 2-week period. It's been shrunk a little bit.
Well,
there needs to be a significant period.
It's 40 in Pennsylvania, but that seems to be it's hard to take that back without somebody labeling it Jim Crow 2.0 or something. Look, you have no excuse absentee balloting. That's fine. But I think
Virginia has that. They didn't used to be the law in Virginia, but a few years ago, Virginia instituted no excuse absentee voting.
Right. But again, this is not about people who want to vote. It's just about getting people who don't want to vote and being able to harvest the ballots. But what I'd really like to see, but Josh, be that as it may, what I'd like to see is early counting. I think this counting that goes on for 2 or 3 weeks is just ridiculous. It doesn't restore faith in democracy. It just raises more questions and the like. And so I'll just end with that. Now, I tend to be old school on that, but you shouldn't have to wait 2-3 weeks if some of these races are to be decided by 10 points.
Well, do you think Tom, to do that, you have to do away with paper ballots. It has to be all by machines, because the delay in the counting is because some states, some fairly large states, still have paper ballots.
Do you think it's possible for any compromise? I mean, some states like California allow people to postmark their ballots on election day, but it doesn't get received. I think they can count. They don't have to be received till 4 or 5 days after the election, which is one reason why we see this slow count in California. But we may not know the winners in some of these House races in California until a month after the election. Do you think that there's any opportunity for some bipartisanship to kind of acknowledge early voting, but also try to acknowledge that it needs to be a more efficient count in some of these states?
Tom, what do you think?
Well, I think there's the opportunity to do it. I'm not sure. I mean, people who benefit from a system tend to not want to change it. But I just my own opinion, I don't think that helps restore faith in democracy when it's taking you so long. You take a look at Brazil, how quickly they were able to count their votes, or France, or Israel. And you look at the United States, which should be the model for democracy, and we're sitting here. Look, some of these races that haven't been called, they're going to be 10-point races at the end of the day because they're just so slow. And I just think it's gone way out of control at this point, and nobody wants to say anything for fear of being labeled something they're not.
I agree with Tom on that. And in some states, you couldn't start counting the absentee but mail vote until election day. That's nuts. In Texas, which again is not the most progressive state in the country, we have a system where you can start counting and verifying signatures for the absentee ballots way in advance of election day, and so that it's all completed by election day. And in fact, now in my state, at 7 o'clock when the polls close, they announce the in-person early vote and the absentee voting by mail. They've counted all those, and there's no reason why you couldn't do that.
And Josh, I just also add, Republicans got to get with it. I mean, they are way behind on this kind of thing. And part of this was Trump trying to demonize early voting and absentee balloting and the like. But if Republicans want to be competitive, they've got to be better at getting their votes out early.
In fact, just the opposite is what's happened because of Trump, is that he's discouraged people from voting early and said, wait till election day. That was a mistake.
Got a couple more questions. One has to do with former President Trump. What's going to happen with the subpoena for him in Congress? Does that ever happen? And I think more broadly, I'm kind of curious what you think, whether the DOJ takes any action against him.
Well, number one, it's a House subpoena. And their House changes hands, and I suspect the subpoena will be withdrawn. So he's just got to run out the clock.
There are some of these. There are state cases too.
But he asked about the subpoena in Congress. I think the other cases, the courts are going to have to make a decision, and he's not above the law. But for right now, had the Democrats kept the House, I think eventually he'd be forced to testify.
I agree with that.
I think that subpoena disappears on January 3rd in the House at this point. One of the other problems is you're going to have subpoenas going to administration officials who are going to refuse to testify. And at that point, the Republicans have to decide if they want to go after inherent contempt, something that hasn't been utilized for like 80 years, 90 years. And if they want to do that, because they're not going to have the Biden administration's Justice Department enforce those subpoenas. So they're going to have to come to grips with how do you want to do that? They do have authority to levy fines on their own. Without the executive branch, they have a levy to put people, to keep them, to actually put them in jail. But it just hasn't been used, and you better be on the right side of public opinion before you use that. So they're going to be faced with that. And given their narrow margins, I'm not sure, how much they want to stick their necks out on that kind of thing, but we'll see.
We have a question about the lame duck session coming up. The question is, do you see environmental policies, climate change, and anything related to that being a relevant issue during the lame duck session? And I'll broaden it out a little bit more. Like, how much of a factor did climate change play in getting Democrats to show up? Or I think it was the CNN exit poll, the NEP poll. It did rank as an issue. But how big of an issue is the environmental?
It really depends, Josh. It really depends on the state. Environmental issues are much more important than in some states than they are in others. Environment is a big issue in Colorado, for example, and there are other states like that. So you can't generalize on this, but it does not rank at the top of the list or anywhere near the top of the list among all voters. So we'll have to wait on that. Regardless of where it ranks, I don't think the lame duck is going to deal with environmental issues. That'll have to be hashed out in the next Congress.
Yeah, and it's a two-edged sword, as you know. Look at West Virginia. I mean, how does Manchin deal with that the next time? It's a very two-edged sword how the environment plays, depending, if you're an energy-producing state or. But I don't think you'll see much in the lame duck.
In a few years ago, after I was out of Congress, I was involved in working on behalf of an issue to have a law repealed, a 40-year-old law which prevented the U.S. Producers from exporting crude oil. And there was a trade-off in which the Democrats because of strong support in the environmental community, insisted that there be an extension of tax credits for wind and solar. And the Republicans didn't want to do that, but they did want the law repealed. So ultimately there was a deal, and there was an extension of credits for wind and solar. I think alternative energy is still very important. You can't rely on that. We still have to have oil and gas for the foreseeable future, but we do need to do everything we can to increase and to promote other sources of energy.
We only got a few minutes left, so I want to look forward with my final couple questions. Georgia's runoff is in December, the first week of December. We saw the Democrats win both seats in the runoff 2 years ago. What do you expect in the dynamic between Senator Warnock and Herschel Walker in this?
Well, let me start on that. I think the Republicans are going to have a very difficult time turning out their vote. Had this been for control of the Senate, they could have mobilized a lot of people, even people who don't particularly like their candidate. But since it no longer determines control of the Senate, I think they're going to have a hard time. It's not easy to turn out votes in any runoff. I've been involved in a state where we have runoffs, and you've really got to work hard. I think the Democrats will work this as well as they have in the previous time. I think that the current senator will win, and I think the Republicans may have an enthusiasm gap, Tom, because this doesn't determine control of the Senate.
No, but as you noted, it determines control of subpoenas in the Senate. Look,
I know, but that's a hard issue to sell.
The turnout will be less than it was in the runoff because you got a month less than you had before. Walker does not benefit from having a popular Republican governor at the head of the ticket that brought people out the last time. So he's got to get them out on himself, and he's had his challenges with his resume. But because it's not the deciding vote, we just don't know how this cuts at this point, what enthusiasm comes in at this point. Traditionally, these elections afterwards have helped Republicans. Warnock turned it on its head the last time around. Democrats have got together a pretty smooth operation. So I think bets are off in terms of where it goes, but Walker's on his own at this point in terms of getting people out. And it's going to be a little bit tougher for Republicans without a popular governor at the head. I think that probably helped Walker net. It was a dead even race. I think it was 35,000 votes or something out of several million. So
I think Democrats will win the runoff.
Yeah, I'm out of the prediction business right now. I'll tell you the day after.
Yeah.
Finally, I don't want to ask a prediction, but I want to kind of get your advice for your respective parties. We're looking at the results suggesting we're in a divided country. Republicans have a narrow majority in the House. Democrats likely will have a narrow majority in the Senate. Coming down to Georgia once again. What would you advise your respective parties to expand that 50-50? Get more, a little bit of a bigger slice of the pie, so to speak. What should Republicans do? What should Democrats do as we get into the presidential campaign in 2024?
Tom, you can go first on this one.
Well, I think, look, you need to be a welcoming party. The untold story for Republicans in this midterm is they're picking up more minority voters. You've doubled the number of African-American Republicans in the conference. You got at least 4 now coming up. You're going to have a different face to the party. And I think that breaks down the Democrats' party identification by race that has helped them for so long. Which I've been identity politics. As Republicans get more and more members from these groups, I think you've had people vote for the Democrats because of their identification, racially or whatever, and not because of issues. And I think this gets Republicans. To that next level on that. So I don't. The answer is I don't know.
One thing, and I'm not in the business of giving advice to Nancy Pelosi. I think she has been a terrific speaker, one of the best speakers this country has ever seen. She has to make a decision whether she wants to continue to occupy the top leadership position. That's her decision. Regardless of what her decision ultimately is, the Democrats need to be in a position of having younger people in key positions. And the media is seeing younger voices for the Democratic Party. That's very tough because Pelosi's team is all over 80. And I'm not sure how she does that, assuming she stays. But we have got to showcase and provide opportunities for younger Democratic members of the House of Representatives.
And Josh, let me just say, I think Republicans have to be careful what fights they pick. That's the key. Don't pick fights that are going to help you in a primary. pick fights that'll help you in a general. I'm not sure they'll do that, but that's what they need to do.
Well, we're at 1 o'clock, and I wanted to thank once again Congressman Davis, Congressman Frost for joining us for the webinar today. I really learned a lot, and boy, we're still poring over the results that are still coming in some states. So a lot more to talk about, but thank you to FMC for putting this all together and having this conversation. We'll see you next time. Thank you very much.